Ray Dalio is a world-class macroeconomic investor who built the largest hedge fund in the world, Bridgewater Associates, managing more than $150 billion. He is more than a businessman philosopher. He is a student and a teacher who believes passionately in the Socratic dialogue and radical transparency. Ray Dalio has laid out his philosophy of management, life, and success in 3 previous books: Principles, Life and Work, Principles for Navigating Big Debt Crisis, and Principles for Success. In his new book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, Why Nations Succeed and Fail, Dalio becomes a historian, combing 500 years of the past to understand the future. I am pleased to have Ray Dalio on this program. Welcome.
Thank you. So good to be here with you again.
Since I've known you, you've started writing books. What was that about for you?
Well, when I started the transition, I had all these principles that I wrote down, and they're like recipes. And I decided, well, I thought I'd pass them along. And then because the first one had so much of an impact, I decided that I'd continue to pass it along. But this book that I just did was written for me to deal with what's going on now. Not only me, but Bridgewater. To how do we deal with what's going on now? Because one thing I learned is that many times I was surprised in my life. It's because of things that never happened in my lifetime before, but happened many times in history. And so for that reason, I needed to study the 500 years. So in this particular case, it was because I had a compelling need to share. Before, I was very, very, very private. And also, I didn't have any desire to share. Now I have a desire really to pass things along.
You've become a teacher.
A teacher, a sharer.
Yeah.
I like to put it out and have others critique it, reason. Is it true? Is it not true? Consider for themselves.
Let me talk a minute about 2008. You found nothing like that had happened in your lifetime, but you went to the Depression and FDR to understand. What did that teach you?
Well, I'll tell you one story just before my doing that. 1971, I was clerking on the floor of the stock exchange, and Nixon got on television on Sunday night, and I watched him tell the country and tell the world that the promise to take paper dollars and turn them in for gold was going to be defaulted on. And I was shocked. I went down on the floor of the exchange.
And had never experienced anything like that in your life.
Never experienced that in my lifetime. I went on the floor of the stock exchange. I thought it would go down a lot. It went up a lot. I was wrong. So I studied history, and the exact same thing happened on March 5th, 1933 by Roosevelt doing it over the radio, the exact same thing. And so that taught me that I needed to do that. So of course, I needed to study the Great Depression. I needed to study the 1929 to 33 period. And it happened in exactly the same way. Exactly. A debt crisis when you hit 0 interest rates and the Federal Reserve couldn't ease anymore. And I saw that. And for the first time since then, in 2008, the Federal Reserve printed a lot of money and bought a lot of financial assets. I would not have understood that if I didn't understand that, study that 1929 to 33 period. So I learned the lesson.
How do you go about studying history?
Well, first of all, I've got a fabulous team that can gather all sorts of data and everything. But I like to do it as though I'm going through the real experience. I like to not read history in retrospect, but read the papers as things are transpiring and imagine that I'm going through it. And then I gather a lot of information. Then I also speak with people, I'm very lucky that I could speak with people like Henry Kissinger and others who they teach me, about the history and the many dimensions, because it's all connected. But there are areas that are not in my domain. So I speak to the best people, including the equivalents in China and others, to learn. So it's a learning experience. And then I learn, I write, I get it critiqued, learn, write, get it critiqued.
Is it a principle then that history repeats itself when similar factors converge?
Yeah, that the cause-effect relationships are by and large timeless. There is evolution, Evolution is how something changes over a period of time. And then around those things are these cycles. Because if they're put in the same position, let's say a Federal Reserve is put into a position of having to decide, do you have defaults or do you print money? There's a choice, and that choice repeats over history. And so you can see what are the indicators of that position and what are the reactions and what are the choices. So the cause-effect relationships, by and large, remain the same through history.
Did you ever find a case where it didn't work?
But there's always a reason. I mean, in other words, there's a new invention or there's something that changes, and that's still part of the process. So yes, for example, the world has become a much smaller place. New technologies are invested in
technology and communication
and all of that, the instantaneousness. However, that evolves over a period of time. And so you could see those types of changes too.
Are we looking at a moment?
Don't get me wrong, I'm not always right. I am emphasizing, though, that by and large, the cause-effect relationships are the same. So when we start to get into the particulars of them, you'll see how that creates the situation that we're in.
And what is the moment we're in now? Are we, in your judgment, in a moment in which the world order is going to change?
Yes, we're changing the world order, okay? In 1945, we started the New World Order. What I mean is, throughout history, there's a fight for control because there's no world court that you go to and plead your case. And so there's a fight for power. So there's a war, and then the winners come out of that war, and the winners set the rules. And so 1945, the United States had 80% of the world's money. Gold was money at the time. It had half the world's GDP. It had a monopoly on military power. So the U.S. set the world order. That's why the United Nations is in New York. Washington, D.C. has the IMF and the World Bank.
And its currency became the reserve currency.
And its currency became the reserve currency because of that set of circumstances. Okay, things evolve, things change, okay, over history. So the three big things that are changing now that haven't occurred in our lifetime is the amount of debt and money creation, which affects the value of money, and you could see it affecting what's going on every day.
Large debt means the printing of money.
Right. The large debt puts central bankers in a choice. Do you pay it back with hard money, or do you pay it back with printed devalued money? And if you pay it back with hard money, it's hard. In other words, that's when you have debt crises. So in all cases, they eventually print money, and that produces inflation, right? So that dynamics, the first...
And that's the place we are at this moment.
That's the place we are at this moment.
Okay.
And we'll talk about that.
We'll drill down on that.
In a minute. The second is when there's a great internal conflict, usually when there's a large wealth and values gap, and at the same time as you have a financial problem. Then you get populism of the left and populism of the right. In other words, those who feel disenfranchised want people who are going to fight for them. They don't want compromisers. They don't want them to be in the middle because middle means that they're not fighting for them. They want them to have guts. So that you have populists of the left and populists of the right.
And their positions harden.
And their positions harden, and there are no compromises. That's why we're potentially in a situation that you could see in one of these elections, maybe in 2024, that neither side would accept losing. Perhaps we see that. You see, maybe you don't follow the rulings of the Supreme Court. Anyway,
that's a serious question today.
So these things have not happened in our lifetime, but they happened many times in history. So if you look at that, you see from those patterns why the gaps become greater and the positions harden, and you see the dynamic. So that's the second. And the third is the rise of a great power to challenge the existing great power. In other words, I gave you the example of how the United States was so dominant in 1945. Now it's not as dominant. It is not dominant. In other words, China and the opposition is as strong as the United States and its allies. And so we have a conflict. And there are 5 kinds of wars. And they start in this order, just sequentially, typically. A trade war, a technology war, a geopolitical influence war. Then you get into a capital and economic warfare, which we are now with sanctions. They always happened in history. And then there's a military war. And so you could see that progression happen through time. And that creates a template. So I like to look at the template and then plot dots to see how we're transpiring relative to that template.
Should Janet Yellen have seen this inflation?
I think she should have seen this, yes. I think that there's a tendency to look at the economy in a rear view mirror and seeing low levels of inflation and also not understanding monetary inflation. There are two types of inflation. There's an inflation when the demand is pressing up against the ability to produce. And so we had that kind of inflation. Unemployment rates go down and there's a limit to the capacity to produce. There's also a monetary inflation. And a monetary inflation means, very simply, if you produce more money in credit, if that increase is greater than the production of the goods and services, prices will go up. And what that happens, it creates a spiral, which we're seeing now. In other words, the selling of bonds. So it makes the imbalance become greater because not only do you sell the bonds to pay for the deficit governments do, but holders of bonds choose to sell bonds because they're not producing a good real return. Now that just mechanistically may be a little bit tricky for some people, but what that means is when you have a big supply-demand imbalance like that, either interest rates have got to go up to curtail that demand, or the central bank has to print more money, and they always print more money. So that dynamic of monetary inflation, the type of thing that makes the 70s, or the type of thing that makes inflationary depressions like happened in the Weimar Republic in Germany in the early 1920s, that kind of inflation I don't think is paid enough attention to.
What causes it to lead to recession?
Inevitably, there's a certain amount of debt that has to be paid. And one man's debts are another man's assets. And the more debt you have, the bigger the problem is. And so when you have a lot of debt and you have to pay it back, you're either going to pay it back in hard money or you're going to pay it back in depreciated money. And that becomes the choice of the central bank. That's why you get stagflations. That's why we have an environment like we have now.
Are we close to having stagflation?
Yeah, we are in stagflation.
We are. Stagflation is simply where, you have inflation and yet at the same time, you have high unemployment.
Yeah, you have economic weakness.
Right.
In other words, you have a stagnant economy. Essentially means
meaning growth is reduced.
Low growth, and with high inflation. And that happens through this monetary situation that I'm describing, in which the central bank tries to deal with a middle course. In other words, what does the central bank want? Not too high inflation and not too low growth. And so when there's a lot of debt, because one man's debts are another man's assets, it becomes very difficult balancing act. And that is when you have stagflation, when you produce it. So just like in the 1960s, late 60s, we spent a lot of money on guns and butter, we called it,
right.
The Vietnam War and social programs and so on. We wrote too many checks relative to the money we had in the bank, which was gold at the time. 1971, the devaluation. Then they print a lot of money into that stagflation. So stagflation is is the middle course when there's two different.
So the Fed and Jay Powell has a balancing act that he has to achieve in order to try to ward off a recession.
Right. So think about it this way. How does he literally fight inflation? Because everybody says tight money policies, and how do you fight inflation? Well, the way that happens is you get people to spend less by taking money and credit away from them.
Right.
So he will reduce the amount of money and credit that's available. The Federal Reserve is going to sell $1.1 trillion of debt that it has, debt assets, bonds. Right. And then they're going to raise interest rates. So they create a squeeze that reduces demand at the same time as people don't have enough money because inflation is high. So that
and their buying power is less.
That's right, because inflation is high, the buying power is less. And then what that act is to reduce buying power again, to reduce inflation, but it comes at a big cost, and that is stagflation.
Is the United States in a unique position because the dollar is the reserve currency of the world?
Of course. It's the unique privilege. It's, in fact, really the only really unique power of the United States now. The military power.
It's the only unique economic power of the United States.
Only unique, really most important power of the United States. It's the only unique power of the United States. I mean, of course, we have a legal system and we have other things that are good. But I'm saying, if you now look at the United States, it's no longer dominant militarily. It's no longer dominant economically.
Because China has become
comparable.
And it's becoming even more so.
Right. And as a larger trading partner with other countries than the United States is, the amount of trade and so on. It's a very unique power. Think about it. You can print the money that the world will accept. Now, that means when they accept it, they buy your bonds. They buy your debt. That's what they hold these in, which are promises to receive this currency that you could print.
Right.
So there are two things now that are jeopardizing that position. Dollar's now strong, but there are two things we want to hold on to that position. Two things that threaten it. The first is the printing and devaluing money, but all countries right now are doing it. So in all countries, currencies are depreciating against goods and services prices. And then the other issue, which is interesting, is the weaponization of the dollar in the form of sanctions.
The dollar is no longer the reserve currency. What is likely to be the reserve currency of the world?
This is the question. All currencies, usually during these period of time, depreciate together. So in the 1930s, all the currencies depreciate. They depreciated then against gold. They depreciate against assets, against real estate prices and a number of things. But we're coming into a new world in which the real question is what will be the new currency. And it may not be just a government currency. There's questions of, is it crypto? Is it gold? Is it other things? And we'll find out. I think the elements of a currency are important to keep in mind when we go through this checklist. So a currency is a medium of exchange. And we'll have all of those currencies continue to be, including the dollar. But it's also a storehold of wealth. And that means that the bonds or what you store it in has to have a real return. And none of the major currencies have that. That's why you're seeing movements out of all of those and into other assets, and why you're seeing the bond market sell off.
China holds a lot of American debt.
Yeah.
Should we worry about that?
I think they should worry about it more than we should worry about it.
Meaning?
They won't. I don't believe that they'll sell the debt. And if they sold the debt, we would, again, like others, we would just print more money and it would depreciate in value. I think that they know, and have known for quite a long time, that the position that they have in that debt is something that they're going to have to stick with.
It created simply because we were buying all of their goods.
That's right. The way it worked is they produced inexpensively. We all thought this is a good thing. I thought it was a good thing. They produce inexpensively, and they earn money. And then they take a lot of that money that they earn, and then they lend it to us. I remember when this started, the per capita income in the United States was 40 times the per capita income in China, and they're lending to us. So we borrow this money, and they buy our bonds. And I don't know who got the better or worse deal, but anyway, that's what happened.
You know, the interesting thing about talking about per capita anything with respect to China is you're talking about 1,400,000 people.
That's right.
And so therefore the multiplier effect is extraordinary.
That's right. Since I started going, look at it this way, it's a big thing. The population in China, the capitas, are more than 4 times that in the United States. Since I started going to China in 1984, per capita income has increased by 27 times. If it increased to half of what the United States is, that would mean it's economy would be twice the size of the United States. So it's a big force.
Yeah, I want to talk about China later, but one of the things that I understand they're trying to do and have tried to do is to move from being an exporting nation to a domestic consumption nation.
Yes, and
because of the buying power of 1,400,000 people.
Correct. And simultaneously, given the risks in the world, they want to be self-sufficient. And similarly, the United States wants to be more self-sufficient, and other countries are wanting to be more self-sufficient because they're worried about being cut off.
Cryptocurrency. What's your opinion?
Well, there's a lot that goes under the category of cryptocurrency. I'm assuming that you're really meaning like Bitcoin, something
yes,
like that. So elements, I think, of a currency that I think that are important is can you buy and sell things all around the world with it? Is it going to be private currency that you're not dependent on others? Like gold, one of the things about gold is it has intrinsic value. So because of that, it's perceived intrinsic value, but you're not looking from a payment for somebody. Whereas in others, you have to have money coming in some exchange that the government can't control it. And we're in an environment now when you have a currency that's a threat. It's so good that it's a threat to the existing currency. Governments will outlaw it, and they have done that with Bitcoin in a number of places.
Including China.
Including China. And I think that they have those vulnerabilities, the digital currencies, they have that.
Is it in your portfolio?
I have a tiny bit of it because I believe
as a learning.
Well, no, because I have I won't give you the exact amount, but a little bit of it in my portfolio because also there's always something new, and I really need to experience it. I need to learn about it, and I never know for sure that that's not the one that's going to be there. So I have a little bit in the portfolio because when you start to think about what are the currencies that have those qualities I'm talking about, that you can keep them, that you can go around the world and so on. What are they? They are very limited in number. So gold, I have more gold than I have by a significant amount relative to.
I assume China would like to see the United States lose, or perhaps I assume the dollar not be the reserve currency.
You know,
of the world.
it was the opposite of that. The main reason that China did not denominate its exports and trade in the currency and did not denominate its lending is that they didn't want to be a threat to the United States. So for all those
and their
years,
thinking was what?
Well, because that's a threatening act. If the United States loses the world, now we were in a different era then, just so to explain it. They became the largest trading country in the world. In other words, did more trade than any other. They could have operated in their currency. In terms of lending, international lending, they're the largest lenders, vie with us, but the largest lenders. And they could have done that in their currency. They chose not to because they perceived that that would be a threat. They were not trying to disrupt the world order. But now we have a different set of circumstances worldwide. Now,
and different leadership in China.
Well, no, this leadership was the same of the same mind. And I think is pretty much today, they don't want to disrupt the world order. They want to, but
Wait, what do you mean they don't want to disrupt the world order? They don't want to
disrupt the world order.
They do not want to be the most powerful, have the largest economy, to have the kinds of things that go with the world order.
Yes.
If you're the leader of the world order, it gives you enormous opportunity.
So I said they want to be as great as they can be.
Sure.
Okay. They want to be as rich and powerful and so on. But they don't want to disrupt the world order. If you look at history and you understand international relations, which is very much like Confucianism, what you have is called a tribute system. And that means each country is in the place, they know their place. They know the hierarchy. Like in the old days, it's almost like other countries would be almost a vassal state.
Yeah.
You would say, I know that you have the power, you pay respect, and you operate in a harmonious way. But the idea of war is a horrendous idea. So to operate, I think that they would probably be just as happy if you divided the world in half, and they were on
And
their
they had
half,
their sphere of influence.
their half, and we had our half, and there was peace in the world. So I'm just saying, an objective is not to dominate the world. An objective is to their objective is to operate in a way where there is no such world. However, that they are as strong and powerful and healthy and prosperous as they can be. We have a situation, of course, in that you have the remnants of where the United States is in terms of the world order, and so everybody can't agree on how to do that.
I want to just stay with reserve currency for a second. So we should expect that the United States and the dollar will remain the reserve currency, or not?
It's in significant risk, but they're no good competitors. So the issue will be, what are your storeholds of wealth? And that's why you'll see inflations. And so your buying power, where do you store buying power will be the question, and it will not be in any one of those reserve currencies, that they won't be good. And so that will be the question of what is the storehold of wealth, like a currency is, that is accepted all over the world. And so that'll be the issue, the big issue over a period of time.
The increase in inflation over the last year is 8.6% or something like that. It's a huge number.
I want to explain inflation in a very simple way. There's a certain amount, quantity of buying, that is of how much money and credit you're given, divided by the amount of quantity of goods and services sold. In other words, if there's a lot more money and credit produced than there is goods and services produced, you will have an inflation, and the magnitude will be a function of that ratio. Over that period of time, there was a very enormous amount of money and credit that was produced, and there were some bottlenecks and shortages of production and disruption because of mostly of a combination of COVID and also geopolitical issues. Yeah. So there was some effect. Most of the inflation came from the production. We attribute it. We can go down to actually calculate it. Most of that was due to the enormous increase in money and credit and spending that was produced.
Go ahead.
The production is now going based on ideological and political considerations. In other words, I talked about self-sufficiency. If you look at China, will be self-sufficient. The United States will be self-sufficient. Multinational companies are going to worry about where they're going to have trade and so on. So the notion of how do I deal with self-sufficiency? We're in a world where ideological and political forces are allocating resources more than economic. The world that we came from, which we almost used to, is where is it most efficient to produce something? And then capital would go there. And then it would be produced. And so when that world of globalization existed, then you produce it in China, you produce it somewhere else, you produce it wherever it's most efficient. Now, the way money is allocated, resources are allocated, is no longer based as much on the profit system. It's based on the ideological, political considerations. If we even think today, where will money go? Monetary policy in the past was just that you would put more money out there and then they would spend it. But the profit system has not been good enough in allocating resources. So you have a big gap, for example, between the rich and the poor. The rich, if everybody paid, if it went where money went, in other words, who's got the money and followed the buying power, not enough will go to the poor. I mean, we talk about, my wife works in the Connecticut school districts, and in one town up the road, it's $14,000 a student per capita spending on students in the school in a poor school district. I'm in Greenwich, Connecticut. It's $24,000. And that resource allocation is no longer going to be able to work the same way. It'll be allocated more and more. You're going to see it more and more based on political and ideological. That's expensive. That's expensive because it's no longer what is the most efficient way to produce it. It's also directed because other priorities are also entering the picture.
Which is a nice transition for me to your second event, which is kind of polarization that exists in the United States in terms of the creation of extreme populism on the right and extreme populism on the left, produced in some cases because of the wealth gap. How did we get to that point?
The way it's been gotten to every time, okay? It's the nature of the beast. Capitalism is a fabulous way of allocating resources to get rich, but it gets people very at different rates. They get very big differences, and also produces a lot of debt. That's part of the capitalist process. And so when there's this large debt and when there's a large
there's a
wealth gap, and then people feel disenfranchised. So it happened in Europe. 4 major democracies chose autocracies because of the fight between the left and the right. Then they called it fascism and communism. But those two, the right and the left, and how to deal with it has always happened. So you go back to the French Revolution. In all of those cases, there were moderates. There were people in the middle who said, we have issues and we have to deal with those types of issues. But the polarity becomes greater. When the causes that people are behind are more important to them than the system is in jeopardy. So you know how it is. How did Donald Trump get elected? What was the characteristics of the population? You can go back and you could see that. So you have fighters on both sides who
do not want to compromise.
They don't want, it's considered weak. And if you're in the middle, you will have to pick a side and fight. There's the loss of the middle. What we need right now, in my opinion, is a strong middle. You need a strong middle, but you also have a political system where you have 2 parties. And because of those 2 parties, there's a tendency to become more and more extreme because those extremities on each part of their party become stronger. So to win a nomination.
Is it as apparent in the Democratic Party as it is in the Republican Party?
Measures of extremism is that, roughly speaking, about 30% of the population, and I won't go into all the different measures, but if I take attitudes, 30% of the population is rather extreme of the right, and about 15% is extreme of the left. You can move that around by 5%, depending. You could say it's 25% is extreme right. And you could say 10%, but it's in the vicinity of 10 or 15% of the left and 25% of 30, measured by a number of measures of what I would consider to be extremism. Of course, that represents then the majority of the Republican Party is in that category. And then a very important part of the Democratic Party is
on the left.
Yet the majority of Americans are in the middle. So you still have, given those numbers, they add up to maybe 40 or 45% of the population. But we don't have a party in the middle. You don't have a middle. You don't have a spokesperson.
Well, you do have a middle in terms of the general election.
No, well,
because I mean, what happens, as you know, I mean, extreme in primaries on Democratic Party and on the Republican Party. In primaries, extremism wins often, but in a general election, it's generally the center that you need to appeal to win the general election.
Well, let me give you a different perspective on that.
You disagree?
It means that 1 or 2 votes can tilt it, and you can change, and that's correct in that sense. But it doesn't have a platform. It doesn't have somebody who says, I want to be bipartisan. I want policies that are going to bring together the country. We don't have a platform, a leader of somebody who says, I want a strong middle. For example, things like education. Investing in education and infrastructure through history have been the most important ingredients. You can't make better investments than in education and infrastructure. and they produce a more broad-based prosperity. But we don't do that because of certain reasons, the Constitution and the like. But in order to do that, you need a platform of the middle. You need a spokesman, I think, that draws people away from the extremes toward the middle. If you did have a third political party, and I'm not saying that's practical, but I would say then you could have a platform, and then you could have somebody that you could look at, or candidates that say, I am for the middle, and that would help to neutralize. Because otherwise, history has shown you go to greater and greater extremism, and then you have the battle. And I think that that's what we should be afraid of most, is that those extremists in a battle having a type of civil war, which I think there's a reasonable chance of. When I say,
what do you mean by civil war?
A civil war, I think we will, that the rule of law and Constitution can be of diminished value relative to power, such as in the elections, neither side accepting losing, such as the Supreme Court makes rulings that are not followed by states, such as population moving from one state to another because the values in that other state are more there. So then it becomes a make me type of situation. Rather than saying, what is the law? It says, make me do that thing. And now when we lose that kind of rule of law and respect for the whole, I think that's a type of civil war. When you watch that, who knows where that leads? I don't want to create histrionics, but I do think.
But are you suggesting it could lead to violence, and it could lead to?
It could lead to violence. I'm not saying it will lead to violence, but the whole idea of in the Constitution of holding arms, and how many there are more arms than there are people, and so on. And when you get into a make me mentality, you could get into an armed situation where a lot of people and guns and crazy things. I'm not saying I'm not going that far, but I'm saying could. But let's bring that back a notch and talk about, can we imagine, you and I, we know history, and we look at today, and it's different. Could we see the failure of following the rule of law and the Constitution? So somebody gets elected and you now know who's going to be in the seat, or you don't follow that, and you get into a power-based situation? Yes, there's a possibility. And the fact that we consider that to be a significant possibility, I put the odds of something like that at about 40%.
40?
40% of that. Happen. 40. Let me be clear. 40% that you have you don't follow the rule of law, that you have a power-based system in which there's not sanctuary cities and those types of things.
You also make this point. You lose the value of truth.
Oh, well, yes, of course.
No one knows.
We don't know what
believe.
Truth is.
Exactly.
Because history has also shown, and we see it, that people have to pick a side. They pick a side and they speak to us. So you watch in the media. Do you get unbiased reporting? It's hard to come by. Even exchanges of thoughts. It wasn't like this. You know this. Even the issue, let's say, of Disney in Florida. In the past, different people would have different perspectives.
The CEO of Disney said, raised questions, and the governor of Florida retaliated.
Right. Now, in the past, each could have a different perspective. You wouldn't weaponize. You wouldn't retaliate to the same extent that we're retaliating with exercises of power and so on. Anyway.
Well, what comes through this too is that you make the point. First of all, you said at one point, or you have been asked, what would you do as president? And you said, first of all, I'd have a bipartisan cabinet. Secondly, you would seek out the middle. Thirdly, you would try to create new rules that would lead to a common prosperity. What do you mean by that?
Well, you have to benefit the majority of the people, and you have to draw on the best people
But
possible.
is
So you
that
have to
not
give
happening
opportunity.
now?
It's narrowing. Just by any of the measures since 1980, per capita income for the bottom 60% of the population has not risen. If you ask surveys of,
And is that a failure of capitalism?
it's a failure. Every system needs to be improved and modified and made better, right? So, and I'm a mechanic, so I just look at the cause-effect relationship. It is because there is an element in which the reinvestment of gains do not go down to create the basics. What are the basics? Yeah, here's all you need. Parents who will take good care of you, a good public education system, and equal opportunity. That's all you need. That's all it has existed throughout history. You give those things to people, and by and large, you have a much more prosperous, you can draw the talent from wherever it is. So those are the things. And we're in a spiral because also the children who grow up in some of these areas from childhood, and they don't have the parents, they don't have the circumstances in terms of the basic equal education and so on. And that population is a growing population. And so we see then the disenfranchised, the opiate addiction, and other issues that we're having, mental health, other issues, is because that population. So let's just go back. How did Donald Trump get elected as president? There was a population that was a disenfranchised population that wanted somebody who was going to fight for him, like populists do. The profit system alone is not good enough.
How would you reform capitalism?
Well, a few things. First of all, I do think that the Constitution makes it difficult to have something closer to equal and excellent education, because education is a state issue.
Right.
And then quite often, typically within each state, it's a tax district issue. And so the public education system benefits those who are there. So you have, but I'd make it broad-based. In other words, and I would invest in areas that have been shown, I see these philanthropically shown to be effective in having a double bottom line. In other words, such as education and infrastructure and programs like that bring back the basics. I think that what I like to do, and I put it out, is put metrics of health. Those 18 metrics that you mentioned in the beginning,
yes,
that I have, I publish them.
Education is number one.
I publish them so everyone could see those things. And you could, like a health check, it's like biofeedback. If those numbers are getting healthier, you're getting healthier. If those numbers are deteriorating. And what I would do is I'd bring those from the left and the right together, moderates from the lesser right, and I'd have like the equivalent of a Manhattan Project that they go, I almost don't care what the particular policies are, but if you have smart bipartisan policies that will improve productivity for the broad-based population, and it comes back to those kind of basic things, infrastructure, education, and those types of things, and they're held accountable by the scorecard, that's what I'd like to see.
Manhattan Project being the project that they brought together the smartest people they could find to create the atomic bomb right before World War II. The interesting thing, too, is I sense about you, who's been hugely successful in America, a sense of not only worry, but concern that it may not be, that what we're engaged in may not be reversible.
The history of these situations make one worry about such things because the conflict and so on goes through a difficult time. I believe that we're at a moment in which we have a choice, and it largely depends on how we are with each other.
We being Americans.
Americans, and then we being, it could be Americans and Chinese, but we as humans have a choice of how we are going to be with each other. The world has more resources than it has ever had. It has more wealth than it has ever had. It has inventiveness that will produce fabulous gains, and that'll continue. But the issue is really, are we going to be dealing with that as a together society? And that's why. Yeah, so
no, I want to focus on that, because that was one of the things that came out to me. This sense that you talk about being, I'm looking for a better word than kind, but that we're good to each other.
It's smart.
Internally and externally.
It's smart. If you put, it's very simple. Don't go to war with each other. Work together, right? Don't go to war. If you do that and you realize that we're all in this together, and then I don't care how you get there, but in terms of that element, I do believe, I believe in thoughtful disagreement.
Right.
The art of thoughtful disagreement. I believe in I believe in win-win relationships, not lose-lose relationships. So, I have a principle.
You believe in addition rather than subtraction.
And my principle is, if you worry, you don't have to worry. And if you don't worry, you need to worry.
You need to worry.
Because if you worry, you will do the things that prevent you from happening the thing you're worrying about. And so, for example, if I look at the term civil war and I look at the term international war, and I can paint a picture of a realistic picture of what that looks like, so the people really see it, like the people who went through those wars in history saw it. If I can paint that picture and then say, one thing we can agree on is we don't want that. Okay, we do not want that. So how? That's why I would like to see, if in the United States, I'd like to see us get strong. I'd like to see a strong middle. If you had a strong middle, in other words, a platform of the middle, and a program for the middle, and a drawing those types of things together, a strong middle. I think if more strong middle, or I'm not necessarily even saying a political party. I don't care if they work across party lines, just as long as they're strong enough to make the case for the middle, and then we stay in the middle and we don't fight each other in this way, because that is hell. Anybody who has gone through a war, this is true for history, you see what happens is the polarity becomes so great that there's no talking. There's just mutual intimidation, and there's a fight. And you get beyond the stage, and the middle gets lost.
How do we stop the demonization of each other?
By empathy, by getting to know each other, by caring for each other. It's like, what comes to my mind is philanthropy. When you go work and you help somebody and you get to know what they're like and you get to see it through their eyes, it's something that's a powerful thing. I don't know that we can do that, but I don't know whether it's fear or empathy, but we need more of it. And I think the middle still is ripe for that.
And do you think America wants that there is a hunger?
I think
for the center, there is a hunger for moderation. There is a hunger for a sense of equality.
I think the majority of people have a hunger for those things.
Yeah. When you saw January 6th, when watching the hearings take place beginning this week, what did it say to you?
I wasn't surprised. I wasn't surprised because the populist
storming of the U.S. Capitol did not surprise you.
The literalness of exactly out of the populist handbook, and having read what happened in Europe during those times.
Right. You mean in the 30s or
in the 30s?
Right.
One has seen that in the past, and you could see it in the air. You could see the circumstances. It's out of the populist handbook, So, I didn't know the event, but coming into the election, I had questions. Then it just falls into place. There's a template that I wrote in the book, and then I tried to describe. There's a template. What comes next in that classic handbook, and then you collect the dots. So I'm never, doesn't mean it'll happen, but there is that template. And in that template is that kind of behavior. So even let's put that aside and just say, I think you and I and a lot of Americans could say there is a risk that neither side would accept losing in a number of elections that might be the presidential, and it could be beyond the presidential.
Well, that's being discussed in Washington as we speak.
So, there we are. So we can agree with where we are. And if you read history, it wouldn't be so surprising to see that arc.
Let me turn to the third point, which is a rising power as an element of changing the world order. You've been going to China since 1984. You know the Chinese leadership. What does China want?
I think China wants to be all that it can be.
Is America in decline?
America is certainly in relative decline. In other words, has been. If you take the statistics that I gave you by any objective measure, if I take share of world GDP, military, the average public education scores of the population in terms of where we are, social mobility. We're education, common education scores is we're in the bottom third of the developed world.
And why is that?
So education, to answer your question, so education is not the same. Military power is not the same. Economic power is not the same. If we're looking at, how we're behaving with each other, okay, it is not the same.
Can different leadership turn it around?
It depends how the population deals with the leadership. Will they select leaders who will allow them to turn around? That's why I think if you were to take the middle and say you have to make revolutionary, strong changes along those lines, then there's a shot at it. The odds are probably against it, but there is only one path, and that is, the path, I think, of a strong middle that brings the country together and says that they don't want those polarities and that does the fundamentally right things.
Using your own metaphor, not only enlarge the pie, but divide it better.
Right. There's the capacity, a lot of capacity to increase the size of the pie and divide it better. And I'm a capitalist, so I don't mean just handing out money wastefully, but I mean there's so many opportunities to improve productivity and produce opportunity in various ways that I just can't believe that we're not doing it, and we could do it.
How do you assess the leadership of Xi Jinping?
The leadership evolved greatly also by the circumstances. When he first came to power about 9 years ago, there were two big issues. Corruption. And that the system, 5 major banks lent to state-owned enterprises and local governments, and there was no capital market for small, medium-sized businesses and entrepreneurship. And so if you take on the progress they made tremendous progress along those lines. So they now have capital markets, and they've done a tremendous job of reducing.
In a country which is ruled by the Communist Party.
Right. But in their way of doing it, which is that it's run like a company, sort of. There's a board, and they operate that way. But in that time, there was a move toward more at first there were 5-year terms, 2 5-year terms. So when they moved into the second 5-year term, there was, because of infighting, there was this, what they call core management. So there are 7 standing members of the Politburo, and 4 of them became more the allies of Xi Jinping. And there is a belief that they're going into a more challenging environment. And then they had this series of challenging, and it's become more autocratic than it was before.
More nationalistic?
More nationalistic. I would say they feel more threatened, and it's created more nationalism. So we've begun this dynamic where it's no longer a win-win relationship. It's more like a chess game. In other words, where do you put the pressures on? So we're in a war.
Do
We're in
we
those other
understand
ways.
China? Does the American leadership understand China?
Not well, not generally
And what
well.
don't they understand?
They don't understand it from the internal values kind of way, having to do with Confucianism, the history, why it's more autocratic, top down, what they believe about that, what they believe about democracy. I think it's very difficult for a lot of Americans who hold close to them the treasured, I live the American dream. I know equal opportunity. I know the ability to speak up. I know that those types of values. But it's difficult for other Americans to understand why they have a different point of view about what works better. It's difficult to do that. I'll give you a very good example of a cultural case.
Go ahead.
May I?
Yes, please.
Okay. And this is not what I would want, but I think it was the NBA team. I think it was the Warriors, but I forgot which team it was. That there was an individual spoke out on Hong Kong.
Yeah, right.
And the Chinese not only punished that team, but they punished the NBA. And like I would say, everyone should have the right to their opinions and to be able to have free expression. Okay, in their view, if somebody's doing something wrong, that they will punish the group. They'll punish the family. They'll punish, in other words, because the group is supposed to be responsible for that. Now, that's something that would be repugnant to me.
Yeah, but it has been said that the Chinese leadership is paranoid mostly about maintaining the power of the Communist Party.
Well, they would view that as very similar to us saying the power of the Constitution.
Because
that is the system, that's the order. In 1949, they made a system. And that's the system. So they view that very similar to us. Well, when we think of party, we think of that same multiple party type of thing. They think of it as very top-down, very hierarchical, and it's like the family. Vice President of China, Wang Qishan, described it to me. He said it's top-down. Americans are bottom-up. They're top-down, and it's more than autocratic. And they say that that's very much their approach.
There's this difference also about.
And the question is, by the way, we have this issue. Are we fighting for that ideology? These are bigger questions. Are we fighting for a democracy and capitalism? Or do we believe that others can find their own approaches and may the best approach win out? And that becomes a big question in that as we pursue it. So that is their approach. May not be my approach, but the question is, they will not give that approach up any more than Americans would give up the Constitution, let's say, or give their freedom of speech up. So we just have to understand.
There is also an element.
You asked me about misunderstandings. And that's why I'm really referring to the issue of, okay, these are those perspectives. It's like a religion. As we have different religions all around the world, they're deeply held beliefs. And each believes in that they're going to get the right outcomes by pursuing them. And what do you do about that?
There's also the question of human rights. And clearly, the Chinese have a different view than a lot of people around the world. How do you approach that? Well,
it's there's me and there's every one of us. It's a cosmic question. Every one of us who buys products, or all the businesses that are operating and interacting with China, or operating in many countries. I could list the number of countries. The interconnectedness of the relationships with China. We import 22% of our manufactured goods comes from China. If you're buying your Apple or you're buying your sneakers, you're in a position that's somewhat similar to me in terms of thinking about what the issues are. What I do is I rely on the guidance of the government, both governments.
My question to you is, what is it about the way the Chinese do things that is instructive for us?
I think in studying their dynasties, I studied
Right.
Since the Tang Dynasty,
Right.
which is around 600, and I studied also other societies. It is the things that I've talked about before. It is in broad-based education. The Confucian system was the first meritocracy that came in to create broad-based education, and then they would have exams. And the people who would get the jobs would be the people who were the most capable, and they got away from corruption and those types of things. I wouldn't characterize some things as Chinese. I think that they're in the history of China, there have been good dynasties and there have been bad dynasties, but there's always the common ingredients of what makes a country successful, and they've been that way uniquely. If you do look at the history, and I've studied the powers and the different strengths. China has hit through history up until around 1840, been always like number one or two in the country because of hard work, because of meritocracy, because of being highly civilized. Yeah. And that's what they mean by civilized.
And because everybody's rolling in the same direction.
And that's what I mean by civilized. In other words, they are working in the same direction and they operate well to be productive together. Those are the same elements, but it's not just Chinese. If you go back to many empires and many civilizations, those elements have been the timeless and universal elements that have been the source of success.
There's always this question, though, and it is about creativity. Does the Chinese value system, does the Chinese history promote, encourage creativity?
If you look at the history of China, there's been more creativity, they're 500 years ahead of us in the printing press and many, many forms of creativity. And if you look at the inventions that are coming out of China now through the entrepreneurship and so on, there's a lot of creativity that comes back. But of course, there's always a balance between being a revolutionary. It's always how far do you take it, you know? So in China right now, there's entrepreneurship, investing in all the ways, empowering, and it's really a capitalist type of approach among entrepreneurship. But they'll call it state capitalism, that kind of an approach. And then there's the question of order. So it is always in getting that balance correctly, because you can have disorder. Like in the United States, we could have enough disorder that could be disruptive to that process. So it's always the issue of getting that balance right. Right now, I think that the tilt in China has been a bit more autocratic, and so they're trying to strike this balance with also creating what they call Little Giants program for entrepreneurship and so on. I think it's become too much that way, and I think just in the United States we're becoming a little disorderly.
Is there any dissent in China?
Oh, dissent?
Yes.
There's not the same kind of open dissent as there is in the United States in terms of how people could speak as freely, nor the media speaking freely, or even listening to things. No. There's not dissent. Dissent is more under the surface, particularly now.
And the attitude towards the United States, it is often said that certainly within the military, there is a sense that the United States wants to contain China.
Yeah, that's right.
Do we want to contain China?
There's a sense in the United States that they are a growing threat. So like in both
a rising China and a declining America. is a threat to us.
That's right. And so so that could be called containment. So yes, I think we want to contain
So they're right.
China.
Those elements of their national security structure who believe we want to contain them.
By and large, I think that's right.
You point out in the book that often a rising power and a declining power, you have a graph where they cross, end up in a war. Do you believe China and the United States are going to end up in a war?
I believe that there's a significant risk of it, but I don't think it's probable. I think that there's, as I say, well, there are 5 types of wars. We're in 4 of them,
right,
and we're at the edge of a 5th.
Which is a shooting war.
That's right. So we are in a trade war, we are in a technology war, we are in a geopolitical influence war, and we are in a, to some extent, a capital and economic war. We are there. And we are dealing with military issues, particularly as they pertain to Taiwan. So we're close.
Could Taiwan be the thing that led us to war?
If we go to a military war, it'll almost certainly be the Taiwan issue.
What are they curious about? Wang Shishong, who's a friend of yours, has had an illustrious career in China, continues. What are the Chinese leadership, when you talk to them, are they curious about America? Do they want to know what's going on in America? Do they have an accurate assessment of America?
They study America, and they, much more than Americans study China. So yes, they have a better understanding, but their concerns are mostly the domestic concerns. Mostly, how do they deal with the demographics issue? How do they deal with
their concerns are domestic,
their own domestic issues? You know, when you run a country, the major issues are the internal issues. How do you make sure you deal with corruption? How do you deal with all the issues that they face? Poverty in the western part of China, the environmental issues, the property bubble that's bursting, the COVID issue. They're mostly focused in on.
Have they handled, in your judgment, the COVID issue well?
My assessment would be that they made a serious mistake in not taking the vaccines that we had to offer. But I'm not the person to make judgments on these things, because I'm not, where am I? And I'm throwing out opinions, but I don't know their whole set of circumstances. But from the outside point of view, it would look like there was a process in which they handled it fabulously. There was, in the beginning, I remember in Connecticut, the governor of Connecticut asked can I get some of the PPE, ventilators and masks and so on from China. And they gave us masks and so on that we didn't have in the beginning. And so in the beginning and then they didn't have a COVID problem because they tightened up. So nobody got COVID in China, and everybody was thinking, okay, they're on top of the world. But then they have no COVID in China, so they don't have immunity, and they didn't have a vaccine that was effective. And as a result, they got into the situation that they're in. Now, how they choose to make the choices of what the shutting down is versus how many people who are older die is, that's their own question. They paid a price, whether they chose to pay the price or not. It wouldn't have been the price I would pay, but...
There is also the threat of natural disasters is much larger than we imagine.
So interesting. When I was studying, history, there were the 3 things that I saw. These economic conditions through inflation and so on. The second was this internal civil wars, and then external wars. And I look at external wars and civil wars, and I say, wow, that's the worst. But I found in studying history that acts of nature have killed more people and toppled more civilizations than either of those. That was interesting to me. Pandemics is one, but droughts and floods.
Right.
And so when we think of global warming and those types of issues, climate and acts of nature really are big influences.
I know people that you know and respect who have said to me the thing they fear most is not a nuclear war, even though that would be a catastrophe. It's a respect for the dangers of climate change. But the thing that they fear the most is bioterrorism.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
The idea of the potential to destroy the planet.
Yeah. So that is also, and then there's different types of cyber, and there's all sorts of ways that we can do each other harm. So it all comes back to that one thing, how we are together.
Where does that come from within you? Is it simply analysis, or is it something else?
Well, I think it's thinking and feeling, by viscerally going through these types of experiences, and then, you care about people, and then, you're in for me, I feel these things.
Another point you made, when you looked at history, I think you said, help me on this, the thing that changed more often was fashion and technology.
Yeah, what I was saying is the stories all seem to be the same. And
the economic and political stories are the same.
The cycles all sort of basically seem, and the only things that would change would be the clothes that people would wear and the technologies that they would use. Because the fifth factor, I listed the four. Right. The fifth factor that is the strongest factor is human adaptability of inventiveness. That factor, which is better now than it has ever been, has throughout history. So there are charts in the book, and you see here's this war and here's this depression, and you look at that movement, and they just seem like blips. They come and they go, and so the capacity to invent. Look at how we handled the pandemic, and so on. That is a tremendous power, and so it comes down to really the power of man. It's in man's hands to be able to have, to work well together and to come up with the inventiveness. If we did those things well, I'm not worried at all.
Is the most important thing you learned in looking at 500 years of history is that when these three factors come together, as we've talked about, in terms of debt, in terms of political division, and in terms of a rising power, causing a change in the world order. Was that the most important thing you saw, or were there other things in studying history that surprised you or made you want to say, wow, I didn't know this?
Well, the acts of nature being such a dominant thing, I didn't know that. And then I saw that. And then there are charts in that book.
Lots of charts in this book.
That shows life expectancy, shows per capita GDP, and seeing that these things would last, maybe they're 10 years, maybe they're 5 to 10 years, really terrible wars and so on, but they don't kill most people.
Right.
And most people get through them one way or another, and then they pass, and then you move on to a higher living standard. And so that arc just always keeps coming up because of man's adaptability and inventiveness. The power of that also came through loud and clear. And that's why I keep coming back to the point that man has that power, and also it just comes down to using that power and being good with each other.
And what did you learn about the power of leadership?
That it very much depends on the people too. That the people play an important role. The dynamic between what the people allow or demand of their leaders is very important. It's not just the leader, but Henry Kissinger just did a book on leadership. It's just come out.
Right.
And he gave me, when he was writing the book, some of the chapters to read and offer my thought. And what I learned about leadership was good leadership varied according to the time and the circumstances that existed. So, for example, Adenauer, who was one of the great leaders in Henry's point of view, what came about when after a country lost a war and it required a certain type of great man for that particular time.
I got you.
And so as time change and circumstances change, the definition of what a great leader changes. But a great leader, in any case, understands the circumstances and has the vision to carry that forward, and that there's a dynamic with the population. And so can you get the population behind you, even when it's a disorderly population? That becomes the great question. Can there be great leadership?
Often you're asked this question, so I'll ask it as well because I'm interested. On balance, having really looked at dynasties and looked at history, and examined it and looked for the lessons, and think about the moment we are in at this moment. I'm thinking primarily of the United States. Optimistic or pessimistic?
Concerned.
Sure.
It goes back to the point before. I would say I would be more pessimistic than optimistic, but I believe the power is in the population if they find a strong middle, if they work together. Now I'll turn the question back to you and say, what do you think the chances of us working well together to do the right things that we've talked about through this interview? Are you optimistic or pessimistic? And what are your thoughts?
I'm trying to be a realist about this. I am by nature an optimist, and I have a lot of belief in the power of the individual and the power of leadership, which is why I asked you the question. And I think that there is hard times ahead, and I think that all the division is there, but I think it can be bridged if we somehow develop the capacity to talk to each other and be willing to compromise. We just saw in the Congress, in trying to deal with guns, a group of Republicans and Democrats worked together to try to create. It didn't go as far as any one group wanted, but they were able to compromise and come up with some things that may be a beginning. I mean, guns are obviously a huge problem and an issue between the extremes in the American.
So I hear
I'm optimistic because I believe, but here's what else I believe. I believe we have to put more. We have to do what you suggested in terms of the Manhattan Project. We need to really make sure that we're using all of the sort of remarkable resources we have in the private sector, in the public sector. And I think we have to ask hard questions as to why we have not done better in education and the whole range. And I think we have to probe deeply in our own curiosity to ask, as I think somebody once said, some people see things as they are and ask why. Others see things that are not and ask why not.
So I think your answer to the question is very similar to my answer to the question, in that it says we need to do that, and your checklist is very much similar to mine. Yeah. And then
I believe that leaders can change things, is what I really do believe.
But since a country picks leaders, we have to have the population as a whole be able to have choose the leaders.
And I think the population as a whole wants the same thing. They do want the same thing. They want a better life for their children than they had. They want common prosperity, use your term. They want a country that they're proud of. I mean, the aspiration is the same.
I agree with that. I would also say that I think they want a strong middle.
They do.
Okay, most of them are moderate still. Most of them would like to work across party lines. So I think I'm hearing your answers to the questions as being very much, and then I think if we take it one step beyond and we say, what is it going to take to do those things? I think then we're going to come up with the same answer, which is that you need to have a strong middle who will then, and then you can have strong leadership from the middle, and you have to bring those together in order to make that happen. Don't you agree?
I do. But I think that America essentially is a centrist country.
But if we look at what's happening and we look at the nature of that dynamic,
and a shift from
we
center
are
left,
in one
center
side
left to center right, depending on the politics of the moment.
But we don't have a platform, a campaign platform for that middle. We don't have leadership in the middle.
And
okay,
part of that reason is that in primaries, which choose leaders, the extreme in both sides has more influence than it does in a general election.
And I'm treating that as mechanics, and so we agree on that. And therefore, if we're going to have a strong middle that we're agreeing we need to have, okay, then you have to do something in which that middle becomes stronger than those extremes. And the question is what that is. That could either be working across party lines, or it could be, if you really want a strong enough middle, then I think you have to almost have a platform of how you're going to do that in order to have a strong enough middle. So I think we're saying almost the same things. Do you disagree with anything I'm saying?
No, I don't. No, I mean, I essentially believe your idea. I mean, I think we need bipartisanship. I think we need, I think we need to call on the best that we have, in a sense, to focus on the issues. I mean, yet,
But if
there's certain kinds of problems.
If we can say that, if I can say that, if you can say that, and others can say that loudly enough, then almost the possibility of it can become visualized. Right. And if the possibility becomes visualized, then the probability of it happening will increase.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about that strong middle and what we need to do, because that will change the odds.
So let me
ask
you this: how are you trying to? I mean, I assume the book is one answer, but how are you trying to promote the idea of the necessity of a strong middle going forward?
I interview with Charlie Rose.
That's one way to do it. Yeah. The book again is called "Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order: Why Nations Succeed and Fail." I can only imagine that this was a journey that had fueled by lots of curiosity and fueled by the great sense of learning. Thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you. And it was a kick to learn. So thank you, and thank you for what you're doing in terms of sharing learnings with so many people through all your interviews. Thank you.
Ray Dalio, thank you for joining us. See you next time.